So I'm here to tell you what you can do if the astronomy career doesn't work out and you're stuck with a pair of binoculars. So does anyone here like the ash juniper tree? Anyone? Yes. All right. There's one person I like in this room. No, hopefully hopefully I can convince you to, if not love them, then at least see some value in them by the end of this talk. I'm going to be talking about being a bird cop. Okay, next slide, Mickey. We've got a bandwidth problem on the computer, so I'm going to have to do this to change slides. Okay, so what am I talking about? They're in this picture. These are my photographs. I'm a really bad photographer. What I'm going to be talking about today is the Golden Cheeked Warbler. You can see one on my shirt. You can see one on my hat. You can see one on my little badge here. That's my bird cop badge. And you can even see them on my socks. These are available from Travis Audubon Society for a very reasonable $15. Mickey, next slide. If you just hit go. There's a bird. And drum roll. It's not going. Yay, there's a bird. All right. Here's an actual picture of a Golden Cheeked Warbler taken by someone who can actually take photographs. You might hear me call them GCWAs. That's the sort of, if you're into bird surveying, that's the acronym used for Golden Cheeked Warbler. Their Latin name is Setophaga chrysoparae. I never use that. And if you click again, I call them cheeky boys because that's the sort of person I am. I love these little birds. I think they're terrific, and I hope you will too. Next slide. Right, so where are they? You are here at Vigilante, drinking some nice beer or something like that. The warblers are about 15 minutes drive away, if that. They're really, really close to us in West Austin. Where do they live? They live in the hill country. They live in the Lampasas Cut Plains, which is just slightly north of here, up to about Fort Hood. They live in the southwestern edge of the Edwards Plateau, and that's it for where they breed. They don't breed anywhere else on Earth. They spend the winter in Central America, and they fly up and down, basically through Mexico to get here. And that's it. So we have to be really careful with this land. What do we know about West Austin? It's expensive. People are building McMansions all over it. So this is a bit of a problem if you need this territory to live in. Next slide. Okay, so here's my wall of text slide about why they're endangered. Essentially, it's just that. They only live in the hill country. The hill country used to be covered in trees. About 200 years ago, cedar trees and oak, mixed cedar oak forest covered about 50%, a bit more of the hill country. And then certain people who looked a bit like me, turned up and chopped a lot of it down. So a lot of that mature woodland went. Since then, and they were doing that for lumber because the trees were actually seen as being quite valuable then. What happened after that? People blamed these trees that were trying to recover the land for water use. They were taking up room for grasses, but they were growing where nothing else would grow. So people have kept chopping them down ever since. This is now being compounded by people giving up on ranching and selling their land to developers who then scrape the lot and build mansions or whatever on it instead. A result of this is the forest gets fractured, it breaks up into little bits. What does that do? It increases its edge area, and that means that more predators can get in. Things like blue jays, things like domestic cats, things like possums. These aren't actually deep forest animals. They go on the edges of the forest. And because we fracture that habitat, that lets more predators in to eat the warblers. On top of that, we've got lots of deer that aren't being predated. We've got feral hogs. And we've got oak wilt that are killing our oak trees, making it harder for the forest to regenerate. So if we have no old growth juniper trees left, we don't have any more Golden Cheeked Warblers. I think that's a tragedy. Why is that? It's because they eat bugs that live in those trees, and they also build their nests from the shed bark of the juniper tree. You can see a couple of these nests here. Those nests are made of shed bark. Go to the next slide. And here's another picture of two of them together, feeding their babies in a juniper tree. So they need this territory to survive. Without mature juniper trees, no more of these warblers. So, fortunately, people haven't stood still, and they've created something called the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve. And this is basically sort of, I guess you'd call it sort of a mosaic of different bits of habitat across West Austin. It was created in 1996. One of the creatures it was created to protect was Golden Cheeked Warbler. There's also the black-capped vireo and 6 different cave invertebrates that it was developed specifically to protect. It's about 32,000 acres, and only about 10% of that is actually accessible to the public. The rest of it, you've got to be a bird cop to go into, or some other sort of volunteer, so become a bird cop. Next slide. So what you'll normally see if you go to one of the tracks is something like this. It says no entry. But some of the places you might actually know in that are really famous around Austin are part of the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve. For example, Barton Creek, full of juniper trees, actually pretty good warbler habitat if it wasn't full of people. Other places, Hamilton Pool is really well known. Mount Bonnell you've probably all heard of. All these places are actually part of the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve. So that might give you an idea of what the rest of the territory looks like. So on to bird cops. So this photograph was taken by Lewis, who's over there, about 7:15 in the morning, which is why I look like I want to die. And the question the bird cops are trying to answer, this is what I call Golden Cheeked Warbler surveying volunteers, like myself, is, do Golden Cheeked Warblers return to the same place every year? Why do we care? The reason we care is because if the birds tend to come back to more or less the same place every year, and then you chop down all the trees that they've been coming from and put a McDonald's in its place, where do the birds go? Some bird species will be like, oh well, and they'll go somewhere else. We don't think the warblers do. They tend to come back to the same place every year, and that's why we do these surveys to try and prove that out. This is really important as well as Texas heats, because the birds in the western end of the range are more used to dry habitat compared to the relatively moist eastern end around us. This is moist, relatively moist. Will they move or not? We don't know at the moment. And also, if you lose habitat, what does that mean for the birds? Like, what is the impact of losing a particular trudge of land on these birds? So what we do is we look for banded birds. What's a banded bird, you might ask? It's a bird who's had little rings placed on its legs. And what we have is the city of Austin and Balcones Canyonlands Preserve and Travis County and a bunch of other organizations have professional biologists. What they do is they ring birds really intensively in specific plots, and they survey those plots really intensively to try and find the birds each year. What we do is we go around those plots and we try to catch any birds that might come back to almost the same place. So the sort of spillover from those really intensively surveyed plots. And that's really what we're trying to do. And while we're doing it, what we also do is we count the non-banded birds we see as well, because that gives us a way to assess the value of that land for the warblers. And so if somebody trashes a load of that land, we can say, well, last year there was 10 warbler nests in that lot. So that had a lot of value. Okay, so now I'm going to teach you how to identify a Golden Cheeked Warbler. So first, the good news, what the males tend to do at this time of year, go to a big tree, sit on the top of it, scream your head off. Mickey, can you play a song, please? So I have a nearly Pavlovian response to this sound. If I hear that, I will run to the nearest oak tree immediately to try and look for the bird in it. There's a really good chance, if you're out in some of the Balcones Canyonlands Preserves, wildlife areas, you will hear that sound at this time of year. That's a Golden Cheeked Warbler male sing from the top of a tree. You can pause the sound now. Sing from the top of a tree, trying to declare where his territory is. And that's how they establish territories and defend their territories against other males, is that they go to the top of a tree and yell. And they'll start, we call it counter singing. You'll sometimes hear one going beep, 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 beep from one tree, and then distantly you'll hear another one yelling back. That's how they establish their territories. One of the other sounds they'll make is the bee song. Play the song. So chip, 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 that's a bird. That's a bee song. We don't hear that very much anymore. One of the things we've found during the course of the surveys the usage of that song has actually declined in about the last 5 years. They don't make it as much, but that's normally the sound they make when they're approaching the nest with, say, bugs to feed the babies with. And now some insider baseball. Get ready for this. These recordings aren't actually online. Zeno Canto, referenced here, is a great place to go for bird song. There's no recordings of this song on there. This is something that's been discovered relatively recently in this area. It's called a sea song, really imaginatively. If you play the sea song, this one's quite quiet. I might have to play it again. Okay, you all didn't get that really, but so that's another song you might hear if you that kind of buzzy sound is kind of classic for the warblers, for the Golden Cheeked Warblers. So if you can recognise that, that's also a Golden Cheeked Warbler song. And my pro tip here is, even though the habitat that they really love has to have juniper trees in it, often when we see the males calling, they're actually on the top of an oak tree, not a juniper tree. That's not always true. This one's in a juniper tree. But don't miss out on the oak trees if you are looking for these birds. Next slide. More songs. Okay, yeah, really important note on this. Do not ever, 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 ever play these songs in the wild around these birds. You will be in breach of the Endangered Species Protection Act, and it will stress the birds. They'll basically try and defend the territory against your song, instead of feeding their young, and they'll spend ages trying to find where this bird was. So please do not do that. Sometimes bird watchers, at least in America, will play songs to call birds to them. Never do that for a Golden Cheeked Warbler, ever. Right, the bad news. So the top row is Golden Cheeked Warblers. The male is distinctive-ish. The female looks really like this one below, the black-throated green warbler. So telling these two apart is kind of the benchmark for becoming a Golden Cheeked Warbler surveyor, because there's a reasonable chance you'll see the black-throated green warbler around here. The first Golden Cheeked Warbler I ever saw was actually a black-throated green warbler, because I saw it in October, and all the Golden Cheeked Warblers have left by then. So how do you tell them apart? You might have to take my word for this. If you look at the kind of the bum of the black-throated green warbler, what you'll see is there's a bit of yellow there. And because you normally see these birds from underneath, because they like to live in the top of trees, normally the way you tell them apart is there yellow under the tail or not? The other one you can look for is the black-throated green warbler has a kind of greenish back, whereas the Golden Cheeked Warbler is always going to be more black, and the face of the Golden Cheeked Warbler is much cleaner than the black-throated green warbler. So yeah, these are kind of tricky to tell apart. So that's the bad news. Then the ugly. Ta-da. So what you normally see is this, which is a tree without a bird in it. There'll be a bird shrieking at the top of the tree, and all you can see is leaves. That's very frustrating. And the other thing that happens, this is from Lewis's Strava. This is us trying to find a Golden Cheeked Warbler. What they tend to do is they fly around. So what you'll do is you'll stand under a tree for 5 minutes whilst this bird yells. You can't find it. Then you see it fly, and then you go to the next tree, and then you can't find it. And then it flies across the canyon, and then you have to go across the canyon, down and up, because you can't fly. And it's good exercise. It's really good exercise, because there's no paths either. It's just sticks and pain. So yeah, that's the bad news. Now, you won't have to do this, because if you're in a nature reserve, you shouldn't go off the paths. We have special dispensation to do that, where we go and survey. So how do we survey? What we're supposed to do is we get given this quite big plot of land. Basically, there's a gate and a load of trees. You go in the gate, and then there's loads of trees. You have to try and come within about 100 feet of every point in that lot over the course of 6 hours. If you hear a bird, those songs we just played, you try and find it, and you just chase it around until you find it. Hopefully you find it. And then we're looking for 3 different things we can mark it as. UB, which means unbanded, there's no bands on its legs. UK, which means unknown, we couldn't tell because it flew across the canyon and then shut up. Or B, banded. In that case, that's a huge deal, because that means that one of the birds that they've previously ringed has come back to somewhere where it wasn't ringed, and that's exciting. And when that happens, we actually call the biologist, and they are supposed to come over and verify what we found because they don't trust us, which is probably wise. So the other reason they don't trust us is because it's actually really difficult to tell what color the bands are. So we're going to see this in the next slide. Here we go. So here's an example. What color are the bands on that bird? Anyone? The bird's about that big. Okay, let's see a hand. Anyone want to try? No? Oh, I see. Yep, so what we're saying, this one? Right. That one? That one? Don't know. Okay, so when this came up in the volunteer appreciation talk, we couldn't tell either. So if you go to go one more time. So we thought it was probably dark blue, black question mark, and then silver. The trick is the bottom right leg will always be silver, because that is a piece of metal that also has identification marks stamped into it, whereas the others are just pieces of plastic. Next slide. So what did we find in 2022, the year just gone? Currently, we're actually doing these surveys for 2023. That's ongoing work. 2022, there's about 3,000 hours of plot biologist survey and about 740 hours of volunteer survey. They managed to ring 89 males and 12 females. That's new ones from last year, so hopefully they're all coming back this year. We found about 161 territories across the area we monitored. And the average size of those territories was about 0.14 hectares. What we also found was that the years 2016 to 2019 were actually really bad for the warblers. There's a big El Nino effect, and those wintering lands in Mexico and Central America, they really suffered there for it. And so we had less of them returning. We had a big bounce in 2021, which was great. And then 2022, the numbers were down a little bit on the previous year. 2022 did have some bad news, however, as well. Only about a third of the warblers they rung actually came back, which is pretty low. That's the lowest on record, actually. So that was pretty sad news. We did have a few confirmed dispersals. So most of those birds that we did detect came back to where they were ringed. However, there's 2 males and 1 female actually came back to a different place entirely. So that makes it worth going out to try and find them when they do that. Next slide. Also, their breeding success was low last year. That's kind of sad. It was about 50% of the nests on average bred successfully. That means they had fledgling chicks going out into the world. Normally, it's about 65%. So that was low. So that's sad. And the other thing that they saw was there was only 1 double brood. So that's when they'll have 1 set of babies, and they'll go and have another set of babies after that. They normally do that fairly effectively. Last year, that we only saw 1 case where that happened. So birds get around. The secret life of birds is pretty special. They get about. We didn't see any broods where a male had a girl on the side. We only saw 1. We saw no cases of that last year, whereas normally there's several recorded cases of that. And we had a pretty high nest failure rate as well. About 43% of the nests failed, so they didn't actually get. They gave up on raising the chicks, either because they're predated or because the eggs weren't viable. And yeah, why was that? Well, one of the big reasons is, if you remember last year, actually we had a really late freeze, and then we had a really dry spring. So what does that mean? There was less food, basically. And because you had that really big freeze, that impacted the insect life, the insects. If there's less food, there's less for the warblers. And the other thing that happened was that they actually got here much later than usual. They got here about a week later than they normally would last year. So that also compressed the breeding season. A week might not sound like a lot, but birds are on the schedule, and they have to go back in August. So actually that really compressed the breeding season. We think that's why they didn't get a second brood off. Yep. So next slide. This is my janky presentation, by the way. a dance or do my best warbler impression. Wee 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 wee. That's wee 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 wee. That's my warbler impression. I'm sorry, it could be better. One thing I will say about the warbler song is, if you need something to remember it by, a lot of people say it's La Cucaracha, which means very little to me as someone who grew up in England. But apparently it sounds a lot like La Cucaracha, I'm told. So you can make of that what you will, but if that helps you remember it, then keep that in mind. So hopefully everyone is now thinking, cedars are wonderful, I love cedars, I love warblers, I don't care about my horrible allergies that I also suffer from. Really, I feel your pain. I will say, if it's in April, it's not the cedar's fault, they stop in February. So right now it's something else. But one myth I would really love to dispel about ash juniper trees today is this idea that nothing grows under the cedars. It's something you hear quite a lot. And the reason that myth has come about is because the ash juniper is actually a pioneer tree. What that means is, if you have really degraded soils which have been dried out, baked, overgrazed, the trees will grow there when almost nothing else will. And so the causality is kind of reversed. What's really happening there most of the time, not always, it's a bit more complicated than that. Most of the time, though, it's because nothing else can grow there. And so when I'm wandering around in my little research plot in Balcones Canyonlands Preserve, I see loads of plants growing under the cedars. All of these photographs, most of which were taken by Lewis, because you can see what they are, almost all of this is growing under the cedars in relatively undisturbed land. You know, you've got this beautiful columbine up here. You've got that's devil's shoestring in flower. I'm now going to run out of plant names, I know. There's some cedar sage in those bright red blooms. Lots of things will actually grow under the cedars. Oak trees clearly do, because the warblers sing from oak trees. So if somebody tells you nothing grows under the cedars, that's simply not true. Next slide. Okay, how can you help? Always a good question. We all want to help, hopefully. I really hope so. First thing is, it's migration season right now. So you can help out the birds. You can also help out the astronomers by, as far as possible, turning out lights at night. You know, those beautiful porch string lights, maybe once you're done with them, turn them off. The birds migrate at night. And the more light pollution we have around, the harder it is for them to migrate. They get lost and they crash into buildings and things like that, and it's really sad. So next one, please keep your cat inside. Please think about doing that. It's actually better for the cat as well. They don't eat trash, they don't get run over by cars, which are everywhere, but also they don't eat the birds. There was a publication in 2015 that estimated that 2 billion birds were killed annually by the domestic cat. And the other thing that came out of that study was that about a third of cat owners think their cats killed stuff, and then they put cameras on the cats, and it was about 75% of cats. So yes, probably your cat, even if they're a sweetheart, sorry. Please keep your cat inside. Volunteer with water quality protection lands, like I do. It doesn't have to be bird surveying. You know, they do habitat restoration. They do a ton of other stuff. And what's best about it is you're protecting your drinking water, because it all gets filtered through the landscape around us. There's a link there, which is probably not very helpful, but I can point you in the right direction. Plant appropriate native plants. What do birds eat? They eat bugs and they eat seeds. Where do they find bugs and seeds? They find them on native plants that grow around here. Your roses, probably not great for birds. Your cedar sage, which is gorgeous, will attract lots of hummingbirds. So maybe think about where you could get some appropriate native plants from the local area. And there are great resources at the Wildflower Centre that can help you out. And then finally, I would ask that if you can't love the cedars, at least learn to live with them, because the birds won't have anywhere else to live without them. You can read this fantastic book, I just finished it last week, by Elizabeth McGreevy, called Wanted Man to Cedars Dead or Alive, to learn more. It's a really good book, and it dispels a lot of myths really well, I think. Thank you. Questions?
That was awesome. All right, so already I was greeted with hands. I'm going to look over here just in case, because previously I had not been doing that. Anybody over here? All right, moving forward. So let's see. Gonna start. Oh gosh, it's such a decision. All right.
Thank you so much. I'm a birder myself, so it was really exciting to come here and see, a species basically endemic like this. And I don't think a lot of states in this country are used to having something that like really depends on like this one corner, and that's it. And of course, this is like boomtown, this area, so it's like about the worst place to be a bird that depends exactly on that place. But a question for you was on nest failure in particular, and I guess if you could define that a bit more, if that was, does that have to do with like egg viability or like the fledglings themselves just not surviving, and then also, or like what stage is it nest failure, and then what causes that specifically, and then finally, I might be wrong, I had thought that a lot of broods in general across a lot of species don't survive. Like it's hard to be any bird in that regard, so thank you.
All right. Nest failure, brood failure, et cetera, et cetera. What do we got?
Yep. So, like you just said, every single Golden Cheeked Warbler is a native Texan. Every single one is born here. So that's really important to bear in mind. To answer your questions, disclaimer, I'm not a plot biologist. I'm a very enthusiastic, total amateur. So what I can remember from the presentation they gave us about this is, yes, you're right, essentially. There are a lot of reasons for brood failure. What they're normally talking about here is when the parents have built a nest and they've started to incubate the eggs, and then they give up on the nest without fledglings coming into the wild. There can be a lot of reasons for that. One of the main ones is predation. That's where habitat fragmentation is really important, because you don't typically get a lot of things like possums, like the domestic cat, like blue jays are a big one apparently, various snake species. They don't actually tend to come so deep into the forest, but the more fragmented the habitat becomes, the easier it is for them to get access. So one of the big ones is predation. We believe another one is food availability. That last year was pretty bad for food availability for the warblers. And another behavior that was observed last year that, as far as I'm aware from the presentations I've seen, has never been observed before, is the females actually shading the broodlings with their wings. And that's not been observed before. So it may also have been simply too hot, and there might have been some heat deaths as well. But that last one is super, super, super conjectural. Like you say, brood failure is a fact of life for birds. Being a bird is really tough. I said 30% of the banded birds came back. A good year would be like 50 or 60. Like, mortality is a thing in the bird world, but last year does seem to have been worse than normal for the Golden Cheeked Warbler, unfortunately.
All right. You persisted and you triumphed. Here we go. And we'll get you for the last one.
Could you give us any information about general life expectancy of these birds? How many times might they breed in their life? And like how large are brood sizes usually for them?
Thank you. Cheeky boy stats.
So again, disclaimer, not a plot biologist, enthusiastic amateur, take all this with a hefty pinch of salt. A songbird like a Golden Cheeked Warbler, probably about 3 years, maybe 4, 5 if they're really lucky. So they will be mature the next year when they come back, so 2 or 3 times, maybe 4.
All right. So finally, patience pays off. No pressure, but it has to be the best question.
So my family and I are currently playing a game called What Bird Builds a Nest on Our Front Porch? And I was wondering if you had any local resources that you might be able to recommend?
Bird identification resources.
Bird nest identification resources? Okay, so I don't know is the the answer that everyone hates to hear, but it's the honest answer. Like the answer to all of these questions is kind of I don't know, and I'm doing my best. But I have a dim recollection coming through the ether that Travis Audubon actually has a bird nest collection. So it may be that if you contact Travis Audubon Society, which is a local bird watching group, I think I remember hearing them say they had a bird nest collection. So that might be something to check out. And if not, they can point you in the right direction.
All right, we have a bonus round question because it's from someone who was featured prominently in the presentation.
What other warblers can you find in this area?
So that's a really unfair question. The answer is most of them in North America because migration is a thing. And Texas is on two of the flyways, Central Flyway, and it's kind of on the Eastern Flyway if they get lost. So pretty much, not quite, pretty much every warbler that comes through North America has been seen in Texas. There's probably about, I don't even know what to say, maybe 20 or 30 species that you see regularly around here. Now's the time to look because they're all on the move. I think I've seen, so I'm not the best at keeping records, but I've seen about 15 different species in my garden, which is not very far from here. Let's see, you will see the black-throated green. So if you see something that looks like Golden Cheeked Warbler, it might be a black-throated green warbler. You will see lots and lots and lots and lots of orange-crowned warblers, which are pretty green-brown looking things with a little orange tuft that you will very occasionally see. You will see some really, really pretty ones as well, like the magnolia warbler is one of my favorites. It has this glorious kind of necklace and then all these stripes down here. You might see a chestnut-sided warbler if you get lucky. Yeah, I mean, there's loads. Black and white warbler, I've seen loads of those. If you go into that's a good one to look for. If you go into the Balcones Canyonlands and you're trying to find a Golden Cheeked Warbler and you don't have any luck, there's a pretty good chance you'll see a black and white warbler, and it's black and white. There's my answer off the top of the cuff. But there's loads. It's a great place to watch birds. Actually, is Texas. You're in the right place for that.
All right, thank you so much. Okay.
If anyone wants a sticker for Travis Audubon's 70th birthday, which has a Golden Cheeked Warbler wearing a party hat on it, which you want that. I've got some here. I also have some pro-bird propaganda and a sign-up sheet for the Travis Audubon mailing list. So come get some.